Hi, I'm Natalie Harper. They say blood is thicker than water, but nobody warns you when that blood turns poison. On my 28th birthday, the two people who brought me into this world handed me a cardboard box and told me I had 24 hours to disappear. Not because I was ungrateful. Not because I was reckless or destructive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But because I had become inconvenient, I had kept their auto repair shop from bankruptcy for 3 years, paid their overdue property taxes twice, and covered their medical bills when Richard's back surgery nearly cost them their house. Yet somehow I was still the burden they needed to shed. What they didn't know was that their lies about me would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. What they couldn't have predicted was that the uncle they'd spent decades badmouthing had been watching everything unfold from a distance, and his final act would transform me from homeless outcast to real estate development tycoon. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up handing you the keys to your own empire. The late March wind cut through Cedar Falls, Wisconsin like a blade, carrying with it the last stubborn traces of winter and the faint promise of spring that never seemed to arrive on time in the Midwest. I pulled into the gravel driveway of the house on Maple Street, the same driveway I'd been pulling into every evening for the past 5 years, ever since I'd moved back home to help keep the family business afloat. The Harper family auto repair shop had been hemorrhaging money for years, a victim of Richard's stubborn refusal to modernize and Carol's complete inability to manage the books. When I'd returned from college with my business degree, I thought I could fix everything. Save the shop, save my parents from financial ruin, maybe even save whatever was left of our fractured family dynamic. What a naive 23-year-old I had been. Tonight felt different, though. The house sat under the pale glow of the street lamp, its white siding looking more gray than usual in the harsh light. The shutters needed painting. The front steps sagged slightly from years of neglect, and the lawn bore the patchy brown scars of another brutal Wisconsin winter. This house had never been a showplace, but it had been home. Or at least, I had convinced myself it was. I gathered my things from the passenger seat, including a small bakery box containing a single chocolate cupcake with vanilla frosting. It wasn't much of a birthday celebration, but I'd learned not to expect grand gestures from Richard and Carol. They'd forgotten my birthday entirely 2 years running, and last year Carol had mumbled something about how 27 wasn't really a milestone worth celebrating anyway. So this year, I'd bought my own cupcake. A tiny act of self-care in a house where caring seemed to flow in only one direction. The front door stuck slightly as I pushed it open, the wood swollen from the recent rain. Inside, the familiar smell of Carol's perpetual coffee pot mingled with the lingering odor of motor oil that Richard could never quite wash off his clothes. The television was on in the living room, some game show blaring at a volume that suggested Richard had been drinking, which meant he'd been thinking about money, which meant tonight was going to be unpleasant. I set my keys in the ceramic bowl by the front door and called out a general greeting to the house. No response, just the continued chatter of the television and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I made my way toward the back of the house, past the faded family photos lining the hallway, past the water stain on the ceiling that had been there so long it felt like a permanent architectural feature. Carol stood at the kitchen sink, her graying hair pulled back in the same messy ponytail she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She didn't turn around when I entered, just continued scrubbing at a pot with the kind of aggressive intensity that suggested she was working through something in her head. The kitchen table was set for 2, not 3. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 glasses of water. For a moment, I thought perhaps they'd eaten early and simply forgotten to mention it. I brought dessert, I said, holding up the bakery box. Thought we could share it after dinner. Carol finally turned around, her face wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger, exactly, but it wasn't warmth either. Natalie, we need to talk. The way she said my name, like it was something distasteful she needed to get out of her mouth quickly, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the March weather. I set the cupcake box on the counter and waited. Richard appeared in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame. At 58, he'd developed the soft, doughy appearance of a man who'd spent too many years avoiding physical activity and too many evenings avoiding emotional responsibility. His face was flushed, either from alcohol or anger, possibly both. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward one of the kitchen chairs. I remained standing. Something about the way they were both looking at me, like I was a problem they'd been discussing, made sitting feel like surrender. "What's going on?" Carol wiped her hands on a dish towel, the gesture more nervous than practical since her hands had been dry for several minutes. "We've been talking, your father and I, about the situation." "What situation?" Richard stepped further into the kitchen, his presence making the room feel smaller. "The situation where you're 28 years old and still living in your childhood bedroom. The situation where you should be building your own life instead of hanging around here." I blinked at him, trying to process what I was hearing. "I moved back to help with the shop. You asked me to come back." "That was 5 years ago," Carol said quietly. "Things change." "What things?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but the whole conversation felt surreal, like I'd walked into someone else's family drama by mistake. Richard's jaw tightened. "We don't need you here anymore, Natalie. We've figured out how to manage on our own." The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked back and forth between them, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some indication that they weren't actually telling me to leave on my birthday. But Carol wouldn't meet my eyes, and Richard's expression remained granite hard. "I pay half the mortgage," I said slowly. "I've been covering the property taxes. I paid for your back surgery last year when insurance wouldn't cover the full amount." "And we appreciate that," Carol said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But we can't have you thinking that gives you some kind of permanent claim on this house." "Claim?" The word came out as a whisper. "This is my home." Richard snorted. "This is our home. You're an adult. Adults don't live with their parents indefinitely." I felt something crack open inside my chest. Something that had been holding together through sheer force of will, for longer than I cared to admit. "I never asked to live here indefinitely. I came back because you were going to lose everything. The shop, the house, all of it. Do you remember the conversation we had 5 years ago? You were 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank was sending notices. You called me crying, Carol. You said you didn't know what you were going to do." Carol's face flushed. "We would have figured something out." "Really? Because the numbers suggest otherwise. I've been keeping the books for 3 years now, and I can tell you exactly what would have happened without my help." "Your help?" Richard repeated, loading the words with derision. "You mean your judgment. Your constant reminders of how much you're sacrificing for us. Your attitude like we owe you something." The accusation was so far from reality that for a moment I couldn't form words. I had never once thrown my financial contributions in their faces. I had never asked for gratitude or recognition. I had simply paid the bills when they couldn't, fixed problems when they arose, and tried to keep the family business from collapsing under the weight of poor management and economic pressures neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. "I don't have an attitude," I said finally. "I have spreadsheets, I have bank statements. I have receipts for every dollar I've put into keeping this place running. And now we're telling you that we don't need your spreadsheets anymore," Richard said. "We don't need your management. We don't need you hovering over us like we're incompetent children." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the television. I looked around the room, taking in the details I'd seen thousands of times before, the coffee stain on the counter that had been there since I was 15. The cabinet door that hung slightly crooked because Richard had never bothered to fix the hinge. The stack of unpaid bills that Carol always kept tucked behind the fruit bowl, as if hiding them would make them disappear. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Carol finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in her eyes was worse than anger. It was relief. Relief that she wouldn't have to pretend anymore. Relief that she could stop feeling guilty about taking my money while resenting my presence. Relief that she could finally stop being grateful to her own daughter. "You're intelligent, Natalie. You have a degree. You'll figure something out." "Tonight? You want me to figure something out tonight?" Richard shrugged. "You can stay until tomorrow morning, but we want you gone by noon." I stared at them both, These two people who had shaped my entire understanding of family, of loyalty, of what it meant to show up for the people you love, even when it cost you everything. They looked back at me with the cool detachment of landlords delivering an eviction notice to a troublesome tenant. "I see," I said quietly, and I did see. I saw that every sacrifice I'd made had been not just unappreciated but actively resented. I saw that my presence in their lives had become a constant reminder of their own failures, and rather than addressing those failures, they had decided to remove the reminder. I saw that the family I'd been trying so desperately to save had never included me as anything more than a useful resource to be discarded when no longer needed. "I'll pack tonight," I said. Carol's shoulders sagged with visible relief. "Thank you for understanding." Understanding. As if this was a reasonable request. As if asking your daughter to leave on her birthday was the kind of thing reasonable people did for understandable reasons. I picked up the bakery box from the counter, the small cupcake inside suddenly seeming like the most pathetic thing in the world. 28 years old, and I was celebrating my birthday with a discount cupcake while my parents kicked me out of the only home I'd known. "Happy birthday to me?" I murmured, heading toward the stairs. Behind me, I heard Richard say something to Carol about getting Chinese food for dinner, as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't just dismantled their daughter's life in the span of a 10-minute conversation. Their voices faded as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step feeling heavier than the last. My childhood bedroom looked exactly the same as it had when I'd moved back 5 years ago. Same pale blue walls, same twin bed with the faded floral comforter, same desk where I'd done homework through high school and college applications and later, the financial projections that had kept the auto shop afloat. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the bakery box, staring down at the cupcake with its cheerful swirl of frosting. 28 years old, and this was what my life had come to. Sitting alone in my childhood bedroom, eating a pity cupcake while my parents celebrated downstairs the fact that they no longer had to deal with the inconvenience of their daughter's presence. I took a bite of the cupcake. It was overly sweet, the frosting artificial tasting and cloying. But I ate it anyway, because it was my birthday, and because it was the only acknowledgement of that fact I was going to get. As I chewed, I began to think about logistics. I had savings, enough to get an apartment and cover deposits and first month's rent. I had a car, reliable if not impressive. I had skills, a degree, experience, managing a small business. I wasn't destitute, just displaced. I could survive this. But survival felt like such a small ambition, after years of trying to build something meaningful with people who had apparently never wanted it in the first place. I finished the cupcake and started pulling clothes from my dresser, folding them methodically and placing them in the battered suitcase I'd inherited from my grandmother. Each item felt like a small goodbye to the life I'd been living, to the version of myself who had believed that family meant something more than shared DNA and childhood memories. Outside my window, the March wind continued its restless dance through the bare branches of the oak tree I'd climbed as a child. The same tree where I'd sat on summer afternoons, reading books and dreaming about the future, never imagining that future would include being asked to leave by the people who were supposed to love me most. I packed everything I could fit into 2 suitcases and a few cardboard boxes, leaving behind anything that wouldn't fit in my car. As I worked, I could hear Richard and Carol moving around downstairs, their voices carrying the casual tone of people who had successfully solved a problem and moved on to more pleasant topics. The sound made my stomach turn. By the time I finished packing, it was nearly midnight. I sat on my bed one last time, looking around the room that had been my sanctuary and prison for the past 5 years. Tomorrow, I would drive away from this house and probably never come back. Tonight was the end of one story and the beginning of another, though I had no idea what that new story might contain. What I did know was that I was done trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. I was done sacrificing my own dreams to prop up other people's failures. I was done being grateful for the privilege of giving everything I had to people who saw that generosity as an inconvenience rather than a gift. The house grew quiet as Richard and Carol went to bed, and I lay awake in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of a home that was no longer mine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new possibilities. But tonight, I allowed myself to grieve for the family I'd thought I had, and the daughter I'd tried so hard to be. 28 years old, homeless on my birthday, with nothing but 2 suitcases and a broken heart. It didn't feel like the beginning of an empire, but sometimes the most powerful transformations start in the darkest moments. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need. And sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you the greatest gift of all: the freedom to become who you were always meant to be. The sun rose over Cedar Falls with the reluctant gray light of early spring, casting long shadows across the frost-covered grass. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me for what I knew would be the last time. By 7 in the morning, I was loading the last box into my Honda Civic, the car sagging slightly under the weight of everything I owned that mattered. Richard and Carol had remained conspicuously absent during my departure preparations. I could hear them moving around in their bedroom, the floorboards creaking with their familiar morning routine, but neither had emerged to say goodbye or offer any acknowledgement that their daughter was leaving forever. The silence felt calculated, designed to avoid any uncomfortable conversations or last-minute changes of heart. I stood in the driveway for a moment, keys in hand, looking back at the house that had defined my world for 28 years. The morning air carried the smell of wet earth and the faint exhaust from the auto shop next door, where Richard would spend his day avoiding eye contact with customers and pretending the business wasn't slowly dying despite my years of intervention. My phone buzzed with a text message. Zoe Martinez, my college roommate turned closest friend, had been sending periodic check-ins since I'd called her the night before with the news. Coffee ready, door unlocked, drive safe. Simple words, but they carried more warmth than anything I'd heard from my own family in months. I climbed into my car and pulled out of the driveway without looking back. The radio played some generic morning show chatter as I drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the high school where I'd graduated valedictorian, past the library where I'd spent countless afternoons studying, past all the landmarks of a childhood that suddenly felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. Zoe lived in a converted warehouse apartment downtown, the kind of space that managed to be both industrial and cozy through the careful application of plants, warm lighting, and furniture that looked expensive but had been assembled from thrift store finds and creative vision. She met me at the door with a steaming mug of coffee and the kind of hug that made it clear she understood the magnitude of what had happened without needing detailed explanations. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we carried my boxes up the narrow staircase to her second-floor unit. "Honestly, I feel like I should be more devastated than I am." I set down a box and accepted the coffee gratefully. Maybe I'm still in shock. Zoe studied my face with the careful attention of someone who had known me for over a decade. Or maybe you saw this coming and you've been preparing yourself without realizing it. She wasn't wrong. As I replayed the previous night's conversation in my mind, I could identify dozens of smaller moments over the past year when the tension had been building. Comments about my presence, suggestions that I should be thinking about my own future, hints that my help wasn't as appreciated as I'd assumed. I dismissed them all as stress from the struggling business and financial pressures, but looking back, they formed a clear pattern of resentment that had been growing like a cancer in our family dynamic. "They made me feel like I was the problem," I said, settling onto her couch with the coffee warming my hands. Like everything wrong in their lives was somehow my fault for caring too much. "That's what people do when they can't face their own failures," Zoe said bluntly. "They find someone else to blame, preferably someone who can't fight back because they love them too much." The accuracy of her observation hit me like a physical blow. I had been the perfect scapegoat, too invested in the family's success to defend myself properly, too desperate to be needed, to recognize when that need had curdled into resentment. They hadn't just kicked me out, they'd rewritten history to make my exile feel justified, even necessary. Over the next few days, I settled into a strange routine in Zoe's spare bedroom. I applied for jobs, searched apartment listings, and tried to rebuild the practical infrastructure of independent adult life. But underneath the mundane tasks of transition, something else was happening. A slow-burning anger was taking root, fed by memories I'd previously dismissed, and conversations I was finally ready to examine honestly. The auto shop had been losing money for 3 years before I'd returned to Cedar Falls. Richard's stubborn insistence on doing things the old way, combined with Carol's complete inability to manage finances, had created a perfect storm of incompetence that would have resulted in bankruptcy within months if I hadn't intervened. I'd modernized their inventory system, negotiated better deals with suppliers, implemented basic accounting practices, and personally covered shortfalls when customer payments weren't enough to meet expenses. More than that, I'd sacrificed opportunities for myself, job offers in Chicago and Milwaukee that I'd turned down to stay and help. A relationship that had ended because my boyfriend couldn't understand why I was prioritizing my parents' failing business over our future together. Graduate school applications I'd never submitted because leaving seemed impossible when the family needed me. And what did I have to show for all that sacrifice? A cardboard box of belongings and the distinct impression that my parents viewed my departure as a relief rather than a loss. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd been asked to leave, I was sitting at Zoe's kitchen table with my laptop open, responding to job inquiries, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my parents' landline, the same number I'd been calling home for my entire life. For a moment, I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the decline button. Curiosity won out over self-preservation. I answered on the 4th ring. "Natalie?" Carol's voice sounded strained, uncertain. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "What do you need?" I kept my tone neutral, professional, the voice I used with difficult customers at the shop. "Well, we're having a little problem with the books. I can't seem to access the accounting software you set up, and there are some bills that need to be paid, and I was wondering if you could just walk me through the process." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Of course. Of course they were calling because they needed something from me. Not to apologize, not to check on my well-being, not to acknowledge that perhaps they'd been hasty in their decision to exile their only child. They needed me to fix another problem they'd created through their own incompetence. "I changed the passwords when I left," I said calmly. There was a pause. "Oh, well, could you give me the new passwords?" "It's just temporary, until I can figure out how to reset them myself." "No." The word hung in the air between us. I could hear Carol breathing, could practically feel her confusion radiating through the phone connection. She'd expected me to comply, to continue being the helpful daughter who dropped everything to solve their problems regardless of how they treated me. "Natalie, I don't understand. These are important bills. The electricity, the water, the business insurance. They need to be paid." "Then you should pay them." "But I don't know how to access the accounts. You always handled all of this." "Then you should learn." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Richard's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Carol's tone shifted, becoming sharper, more demanding. "This is ridiculous. We're your family. You can't just leave us hanging like this." The irony was so thick I almost laughed. "Actually, I think you'll find that I can. Just like you left me hanging when you decided I was no longer welcome in the house I'd been paying to maintain. That's completely different. We needed our space. We needed to feel like adults in our own home instead of being managed by our daughter. And I need to feel like a person instead of being treated like a walking ATM who occasionally gets to sleep in your spare bedroom." I could hear Richard saying something more insistent in the background. Carol covered the phone for a moment, then came back with a harder edge to her voice. "Your father says if you don't help us with this, he's going to call your employer and tell them what kind of person you really are." The threat was so absurd, so pathetically desperate, that I actually did laugh this time. "And what kind of person am I, Carol?" "The kind who abandons her family when they need her most." "Right, the kind who pays your bills for 5 years, and then has the audacity to expect basic human decency in return. I can see how that would be concerning for a potential employer." I ended the call without saying goodbye and immediately blocked their number. Then I called my current supervisor and gave her a heads up that my estranged parents might be calling with unfounded complaints about my character. She listened patiently, assured me that personal family drama wouldn't affect my employment status, and suggested I document any further harassment for potential legal action. The conversation left me feeling simultaneously vindicated and hollow. I'd drawn a boundary, asserted my worth, refused to be manipulated. But I'd also just had my final conversation with the people who had raised me, and it had ended with threats and recriminations rather than any acknowledgement of the love and loyalty I'd shown them for decades. That evening, Zoe came home from her job at the community health clinic with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on her living room floor, eating directly from the containers and talking about everything except my family situation. It felt good to focus on normal things. Her latest dating disaster, a book she was reading, plans for redecorating her bathroom. Small, manageable problems that had clear solutions and didn't involve years of emotional investment and betrayal. But as the wine loosened my tongue, the conversation inevitably drifted back to my current situation. I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently, I admitted, twirling lo mein noodles around my chopsticks. Maybe if I'd been clearer about my expectations. Maybe if I'd asked for more appreciation instead of just assuming they understood what I was sacrificing. Stop, Zoe said firmly. You're doing that thing where you blame yourself for other people's bad behavior. You were generous and loyal and selfless, and they punished you for it. That's not your fault. That's not something you could have fixed by communicating better or setting different expectations. She was right, but the knowledge felt cold comfort. I'd spent 5 years of my life trying to save a family that had apparently never wanted to be saved, at least not by me. The loss wasn't just financial or practical, it was the complete collapse of my understanding of what family was supposed to mean. What happens now? I asked. Now you build something better, Zoe said simply. You stop trying to fix broken people and start focusing on yourself. You figure out what you actually want, instead of what you think you're supposed to want. Later that night, lying on the fold-out couch that had become my temporary bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what building something better might look like. For 5 years, my identity had been wrapped up in being the daughter who saved the day, the responsible one who kept everything running. Without that role to play, who was I? The question felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant starting over completely, admitting that the life I'd been living wasn't actually mine. But liberating because it meant I could choose what came next based on my own desires and values, rather than other people's expectations and failures. I pulled out my phone and opened a notes app, then started writing. Not a job search plan or a practical list of next steps, but a stream of consciousness about what I actually wanted from life. Travel that I'd postponed indefinitely. A career that challenged me intellectually instead of just paying bills. The possibility of relationships built on mutual respect, rather than financial dependency. A place to live that felt like home because I'd chosen it, not because I'd been assigned a bedroom as a child. The list grew longer as I wrote, filled with ambitions I'd buried under years of family obligation. I wanted to matter to people who valued what I brought to their lives. I wanted to build something lasting and meaningful. I wanted to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. Most of all, I wanted to prove that the daughter they'd discarded was worth more than they'd ever imagined. I didn't know it yet, but the universe was about to give me exactly that opportunity. Sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up creating the conditions for your greatest success. And sometimes the family that rejects you makes room for the family that's been waiting to claim you. But that revelation was still days away. For now, I had my anger and my ambition, and a growing sense that being unwanted by Richard and Carol Harper might turn out to be the greatest gift they'd ever given me. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam call or perhaps another attempt by my parents to circumvent the block I'd placed on their number. But something made me answer, perhaps the same curiosity that had led me to take Carol's call the day before. "Is this Natalie Harper?" The voice belonged to an older woman, professional and precise. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Patricia Goldman. I'm an attorney with Goldman Reeves and Associates in Milwaukee. I'm calling regarding the estate of Thomas Whitmore. I believe he was your uncle?" I sat up straighter, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. Uncle Tom had been Richard's older brother, estranged from the family for as long as I could remember. The few times his name had come up in conversation over the years, it had been accompanied by bitter comments about his selfishness, his decision to choose business over family, his failure to maintain relationships with the people who mattered. Yes, he was my father's brother, but we weren't close. I haven't seen him since I was a child. "I understand. Could you come to my office sometime this week? There are some matters related to Mr. Whitmore's estate that require your attention." I agreed to meet with her the following Monday, more out of politeness than genuine interest. I assumed Uncle Tom had left me some small token, perhaps a watch or a piece of jewelry. The kind of gesture estranged relatives sometimes made to ease their conscience about years of absence. I mentioned the call to Zoe when she got home from work, describing it as a minor curiosity rather than anything significant. "Didn't you say your parents always talked about him like he was some kind of villain?" she asked. "Yeah, they made him sound like he'd abandoned the family to chase money and success. Richard always said Tom thought he was better than everyone else because he made it big in real estate." Made it big how? I realized I didn't actually know. All my information about Uncle Tom came through the filter of Richard's resentment and Carol's occasional snippets of gossip. He'd left Cedar Falls decades ago, built some kind of business in Milwaukee, never married, never had children of his own. Beyond those basic facts, he was essentially a stranger who happened to share my DNA. "I guess I'll find out Monday," I said. The weekend passed quietly. I continued my job search, looked at a few apartments that were either too expensive or too depressing, and tried to avoid thinking about the hole that had opened up in my life where my family used to be. Sunday evening, I realized I was actually looking forward to the meeting with Patricia Goldman, not because I expected anything significant to come from it, but because it felt like a connection to a part of my family history that hadn't been filtered through Richard and Carol's dysfunction. Maybe Uncle Tom could provide some perspective on the Harper family patterns, some insight into why things had gone so wrong with my parents. Maybe he could help me understand whether the coldness I'd experienced was a generational trait or something specific to Richard and Carol's particular brand of emotional unavailability. Or maybe he'd just left me a small inheritance and a note explaining why he'd stayed away from the family for so long. Either way, it felt like a step forward, a movement toward understanding rather than just surviving. And after a week of feeling like I was floating in emotional limbo, any kind of forward motion seemed worth pursuing. I went to sleep Sunday night with something I hadn't felt since before my birthday confrontation with my parents: anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made Milwaukee's downtown feel like a noir movie set. I drove through the unfamiliar streets, following GPS directions to the law offices of Goldman, Reeves & Associates, my mind cycling through possibilities about what Uncle Tom might have left me. A few $1,000s, perhaps. Maybe some personal items that had sentimental value. I'd prepared myself for disappointment, reminding myself that estranged relatives rarely left substantial inheritances to nieces they barely knew. The law office occupied the 15th floor of a gleaming glass building that spoke of serious money and established success. The receptionist directed me to a conference room where Patricia Goldman waited, with a thick manila folder and an expression that suggested this meeting would be more significant than I'd anticipated. Patricia was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and the kind of understated jewelry that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. She stood when I entered, offering a firm handshake and a measured smile. "Thank you for coming, Natalie. Please, have a seat. Can I offer you coffee, water?" I declined refreshments, too nervous to trust my stomach with anything. Patricia settled across from me at the polished conference table and opened the thick folder, revealing stacks of documents that looked far more complex than a simple bequest of personal effects. "I'll get straight to the point," she said, pulling out a document with official seals and signatures. "Your Uncle Thomas left you the entirety of his estate. This includes Whitmore Development Group, his real estate investment company, along with all associated properties, assets, and business interests." The words seemed to bounce off my brain without penetrating. I stared at Patricia, waiting for the clarification that would make this make sense. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "Thomas Whitmore has left you his entire business empire. The estimated value is approximately $47 million. The conference room suddenly felt airless. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white as I tried to process what she was telling me. $47 million. Uncle Tom, the man my parents had dismissed as a selfish opportunist who'd abandoned his family for money, had been worth nearly $50 million, and had left it all to me. "But why?" I managed to ask. "We weren't close. I hadn't seen him in 20 years. Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Thomas was a very private man, but he was also observant. He kept track of his family from a distance, including you. He was particularly interested in your business degree and your work helping to manage your parents' auto shop. He saw potential in you that perhaps others didn't recognize. She pulled out another document, this one handwritten in careful cursive. He left you a letter. Perhaps this will provide some clarity. I took the envelope with trembling hands, Uncle Tom's name written across the front in fountain pen. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, the kind that spoke of old-fashioned formality and attention to detail. "Dear Natalie," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably confused about why a relative you barely knew would leave you everything I spent my life building. The truth is, I've been watching your family for years, and you're the only Harper who reminds me of the person I was before I learned to protect myself from their particular brand of selfishness." I paused, looking up at Patricia, who nodded encouragingly. The letter continued. "Your father Richard has spent decades resenting me for leaving Cedar Falls and building something meaningful with my life. He's told anyone who would listen that I abandoned the family, that I chose money over loyalty, that I think I'm better than everyone else. What he's never understood is that I didn't leave to chase wealth. I left because staying would have meant letting them drain me dry, just as I suspect they've been doing to you." My throat tightened as I read those words. Uncle Tom had seen what I'd been too close to recognize, the pattern of exploitation that I'd mistaken for family obligation. "I know you've been supporting them financially. I know you moved back to Cedar Falls to save their failing business. I know you've sacrificed your own opportunities to prop up their incompetence, and I know they've never thanked you for it. Sound familiar? It should. They did the same thing to me 30 years ago, before I was smart enough to walk away." The letter went on to detail Uncle Tom's own experience with the Harper family dynamics. How he'd worked in Richard and Carol's early business ventures, pouring his own money and energy into enterprises that failed because of their poor management and unrealistic expectations. How they'd blamed him when things went wrong, accusing him of not caring enough, not trying hard enough, not being loyal enough to the family. "The difference between us," the letter continued, "is that I learned to say no before they completely destroyed me. I suspect you haven't reached that point yet, but if you're reading this, perhaps you're getting close. The business I'm leaving you isn't just money, Natalie, it's freedom. The freedom to be generous on your own terms, to help people who deserve it, and to build something lasting that can't be taken away by people who confuse love with obligation." He concluded with specific instructions about the company, recommendations for key employees I should trust, and advice about maintaining the business relationships he'd cultivated over 3 decades. But the final paragraph was personal. "Don't let Richard and Carol convince you that accepting this inheritance makes you greedy or disloyal. They'll try, because that's what they do when they can't control someone anymore. You earned this through years of sacrifice they never appreciated. Now use it to build the life they never wanted you to have." I set the letter down with shaking hands, my vision blurry with tears I hadn't realized were falling. Patricia pushed a box of tissues across the table and waited patiently while I composed myself. "He was right about them," I said finally. "About everything. Thomas was an excellent judge of character. It's part of what made him so successful in business. He saw potential in patterns that others missed." Patricia spent the next hour walking me through the specifics of the inheritance. Whitmore Development Group owned commercial and residential properties throughout Wisconsin and Illinois. There were shopping centers, apartment complexes, office buildings, and development projects in various stages of completion. The company employed 43 people and had been profitable for 27 consecutive years. "The business essentially runs itself at this point," Patricia explained. "Thomas built excellent systems and hired capable managers. You don't need to make any immediate decisions about your level of involvement. You can remain a passive owner, or you can take a more active role as you learn the business." As we talked, my phone buzzed insistently with text messages. I glanced at it briefly and saw multiple notifications from numbers I didn't recognize, interspersed with missed calls from what looked like Cedar Falls area codes. "Excuse me," I told Patricia, checking the messages more carefully. The texts were from neighbors, former customers of the auto shop, people I'd known casually growing up. "Heard about your uncle's business. Congrats. Your parents are telling everyone you stole their inheritance. Richard's at Murphy's bar talking crazy about lawyers and family betrayal. I showed Patricia a few of the messages, and her expression darkened. "I see the campaign has already begun," she said dryly. "What campaign?" "The one where your parents attempt to discredit your inheritance and convince everyone you've somehow stolen what should have been theirs. Thomas warned me this would happen. It's why he was so specific in his will about his reasons for choosing you over his brother." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang with a call from a Cedar Falls number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Natalie Harper? This is Jim Kowalski from the Cedar Falls Gazette. I'm calling about your recent inheritance. Your father claims that Thomas Whitmore was mentally unstable when he made his will and that the family intends to contest it. Do you have any comment?" I hung up without responding, but the phone immediately rang again with another unknown number. This time it was a woman claiming to represent a Chicago television station, wanting to interview me about the, quote, family feud over the Whitmore fortune. "How do they even know about this already?" I asked Patricia. "We just finished the paperwork an hour ago." Patricia's smile was grim. Small-town networks are remarkably efficient, especially when there's money involved. "I suspect someone at the courthouse has connections to Cedar Falls, or perhaps one of the clerks recognized the Harper name and made a phone call." Over the next 2 hours, while Patricia and I worked through additional legal documents, I received 17 phone calls from reporters, 3 from people claiming to be long-lost relatives, and dozens of text messages from acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to know about the inheritance, and everyone had an opinion about whether I deserved it. But the most disturbing messages came from people who claimed to be speaking on behalf of Richard and Carol. According to these second-hand reports, my parents were telling anyone who would listen that I had manipulated Uncle Tom into changing his will, that I had stolen money that should have gone to Richard as the older brother, that I was a greedy, ungrateful daughter who had turned against my own family for financial gain. "They're spinning quite a narrative," I told Patricia as I scrolled through the messages. "According to them, I'm some kind of master manipulator who seduced a lonely old man into leaving me his fortune." "It's a predictable strategy," Patricia said. "Attack the legitimacy of the will and the character of the beneficiary. Make you seem unworthy so that their claim seems more reasonable. Do they have any chance of successfully contesting it? None whatsoever." Thomas was extraordinarily thorough in documenting his decision-making process. He underwent psychological evaluation to confirm his mental competency. He had multiple witnesses to his signature. He left detailed explanations for his choices. And most importantly, he specifically anticipated this challenge and prepared for it. She pulled out yet another document, this one signed and notarized just 6 months earlier. "Thomas added a codicil to his will after learning about your recent situation with your parents. If Richard or Carol contest the inheritance, they forfeit any claim to Thomas's personal effects and memorabilia, which would otherwise have gone to them as small bequests." The irony was perfect. By trying to take what Uncle Tom had given me, my parents would lose even the minor inheritances they might have received for being family members. As the afternoon wore on, the media attention intensified. A news van appeared outside the law office building, and Patricia's secretary informed us that reporters were asking for me by name in the lobby. Social media posts began appearing with my high school yearbook photo and wild speculation about my relationship with Uncle Tom. "I think it's time for you to disappear for a while," Patricia suggested. "Let me handle the media inquiries. You need space to process all of this without being harassed by reporters and fortune hunters." I agreed, but as I prepared to leave through the building's parking garage to avoid the reporters, Patricia handed me one final envelope. "Thomas asked me to give you this after we'd completed all the legal formalities. He said you'd need it for what comes next." Inside was a keycard and an address in Milwaukee's exclusive historic Third Ward district, along with a note, "Your new home if you want it. You'll find everything you need to disappear from Cedar Falls for as long as necessary. The penthouse is yours, along with privacy and security that your parents can't breach." As I drove through Milwaukee's late afternoon traffic toward the address Uncle Tom had provided, my phone continued buzzing with calls and messages. But for the first time since my 28th birthday, I felt something other than anger or hurt or confusion about my family situation. I felt powerful. Richard and Carol had spent decades making me feel small, dependent, grateful for scraps of affection and approval. They'd convinced me that I needed them more than they needed me, that my value lay in my usefulness rather than my inherent worth as a person. They'd trained me to apologize for existing, to shrink myself to make room for their egos, to sacrifice my dreams to prop up their failures. But Uncle Tom had seen through all of that. He'd recognized something in me that my own parents had missed or chosen to ignore. He'd given me not just money, but validation. Proof that the Harper family capacity for blindness wasn't universal. Evidence that someone had been watching and understanding and valuing what I brought to the world. More than that, he'd given me the resources to fight back. As I pulled into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise, I realized that my parents' public campaign against me was about to backfire spectacularly. They thought they could shame me into giving up the inheritance by painting me as greedy and disloyal. They thought the community would turn against me if they told enough lies about my character and motivations. What they didn't realize was that half the people in Cedar Falls had witnessed their treatment of me firsthand. They'd seen me working at the shop for no pay, covering their bills, sacrificing my own opportunities to keep their business afloat. They knew exactly who I was and what I'd given up for the Harper family stability. And now they were about to learn what $47 million could do in the hands of someone who'd spent 5 years learning exactly how their enemies operated. The elevator rose silently toward the penthouse, carrying me away from the life I'd known and toward possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Uncle Tom had given me an empire, but more importantly, he'd given me permission to use it. The war Richard and Carol had started by kicking me out of their house was about to become very expensive for them. And for the first time in my adult life, I had more resources than they did. The penthouse was everything Uncle Tom's note had promised and more. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, while the interior combined modern luxury with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of serious wealth rather than flashy nouveau riche excess. I stood in the living room, still processing the surreal nature of my situation, when my phone rang with a call from Patricia Goldman. "I hope you're settling in comfortably," she said without preamble. "We have a situation developing that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" "Your parents have retained legal counsel, Henderson, Miller and Associates out of Madison. They're filing an emergency petition to freeze your inheritance pending a competency hearing for Thomas's will. They're also demanding a full audit of Whitmore Development Group's finances, claiming you may have been embezzling from the company before Thomas's death." I sank onto the leather couch, the weight of their escalation settling over me like a lead blanket. Can they do that? They can try. Unfortunately, Wisconsin law allows for estate challenges under certain circumstances, and they're claiming undue influence and mental incapacity. It's a nuisance suit with no merit, but it could tie up your assets for months while the courts sort through their allegations. The vindictiveness of their strategy took my breath away. Not content with simply kicking me out of their lives, Richard and Carol were now attempting to destroy my future entirely. They would rather see Uncle Tom's legacy tied up in legal battles than allow me to inherit what he'd freely chosen to give me. What do we need to do? First, we document everything. Every interaction you've had with Thomas over the years, every conversation your parents had about him in your presence, every piece of evidence that demonstrates their true motivations. Second, we prepare for war. They're not just challenging the will, they're trying to destroy your reputation and your relationship with the community. Patricia was right about the reputation destruction. By evening, the Cedar Falls social media groups were flooded with posts from Richard and Carol's supporters, painting me as a manipulative gold digger who had somehow brainwashed my elderly uncle into disinheriting his rightful family. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling, featuring fictional accounts of secret visits to Milwaukee, imaginary romantic entanglements, and completely fabricated evidence of my supposed scheme to isolate Tom from his relatives. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves, but watching people I'd known my entire life accept and amplify them without question. Former classmates, longtime customers of the auto shop, even some of my old teachers shared posts expressing disappointment in my greed and sympathy for my poor parents who had been, quote, betrayed by their own daughter. But not everyone believed the narrative Richard and Carol were spinning. Jake Whitmore, Uncle Tom's son from his brief marriage decades earlier, called me directly that evening. I'd forgotten he existed until his name appeared on my caller ID, bringing with it vague memories of a cousin I'd met perhaps twice during my childhood. "Natalie, this is Jake Whitmore, Tom's son. I heard about the inheritance and wanted to reach out." I braced myself for another family member demanding their share of the fortune, but Jake's tone was warm rather than accusatory. "I just wanted you to know that I'm not surprised by Dad's decision, and I completely support it. He talked about you quite a bit over the years, especially after your grandmother died and you moved back to help your parents. He was really impressed with how you handled yourself in a difficult situation. You're not upset about the inheritance?" Jake laughed, a sound that reminded me startlingly of Uncle Tom's rare chuckles from my childhood memories. "Upset? Natalie, Dad left me a trust fund when I turned 30 that set me up for life. He paid for my education, helped me start my own business, supported me through 2 divorces and a bankruptcy. He gave me everything I needed when I needed it. This inheritance isn't about money. It's about legacy. He wanted his life's work to go to someone who would appreciate it and use it wisely." The conversation with Jake provided a different perspective on Uncle Tom's character, one that directly contradicted the bitter portrait Richard had painted over the years. According to Jake, Tom had been generous and supportive to family members who treated him with respect, but ruthless in cutting off those who saw him only as a source of financial gain. "Your parents tried to hit him up for money several times over the years," Jake revealed, "usually when the auto shop was struggling or they had some personal financial crisis. Dad would send a check, but they never thanked him, never called to see how he was doing, never invited him to family gatherings or acknowledged his generosity. They treated him like an ATM, and when he finally stopped responding to their requests, they started badmouthing him around town." This information provided crucial context for the legal battle ahead. Uncle Tom's decision to bypass Richard wasn't based on family grudges or mental incapacity. It was the logical result of decades of being treated poorly by people who only valued him for his wealth. The next morning, Patricia called with an update on the legal proceedings. The good news is that Henderson Miller and Associates is a small firm with no experience handling estate disputes of this magnitude. They're in over their heads, and it shows in their filings. The bad news is that they're compensating for their inexperience with aggressive media tactics. She was referring to the press conference Richard and Carol had held that morning outside the Cedar Falls courthouse. I watched the live stream from the comfort of Uncle Tom's penthouse, feeling a mixture of rage and pity as my parents stood before a cluster of reporters and local television cameras, portraying themselves as grieving family members victimized by their conniving daughter. Carol wore her best dress, the black one she usually reserved for funerals, and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she spoke about the devastating betrayal of discovering that their only child had manipulated a sick old man into changing his will. Richard stood beside her with his jaw set in righteous anger, periodically interjecting comments about family loyalty and the importance of honoring the wishes of the deceased. Thomas wasn't in his right mind during his final years, Carol told the cameras, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. He became paranoid and isolated, susceptible to manipulation by people who didn't have his best interests at heart. "We're not doing this for money. We're doing this to honor his memory and protect other elderly people from being exploited by unscrupulous relatives." The performance was masterful in its calculated dishonesty. They painted themselves as reluctant warriors fighting for justice, rather than bitter parents trying to steal their daughter's inheritance. They positioned me as a predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man rather than the niece, who had impressed him with her integrity and business acumen. But their strategy contained a fundamental flaw. Too many people knew the truth about both Uncle Tom's mental state and my character. As the day progressed, counter-narratives began emerging on social media and in local news coverage. Former employees of Whitmore Development Group spoke about Tom's sharp mind and clear decision-making right up until his death. Business associates described his careful planning and explicit instructions about the inheritance. Community members who had interacted with me over the years pushed back against the portrayal of me as a manipulative schemer. Most damaging to Richard and Carol's case was a video that surfaced from a local business association meeting just 6 months before Uncle Tom's death. Someone had recorded him giving a presentation about sustainable development practices, and the footage showed a man who was clearly articulate, mentally sharp, and fully in command of his faculties. Patricia used this evidence to file for an expedited hearing, arguing that the claims of mental incapacity were so obviously false that the court should dismiss them immediately, rather than allowing the plaintiffs to tie up the estate with frivolous litigation. The hearing was scheduled for the following Friday in Milwaukee County Court. Patricia assured me that we had an overwhelming case, but warned that Richard and Carol's attorney might try to turn the proceedings into a media circus designed to damage my reputation regardless of the legal outcome. She was right. When I arrived at the courthouse that morning, I found myself facing a gauntlet of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers who had driven down from Cedar Falls to witness the family drama firsthand. Richard and Carol had clearly promoted the hearing as entertainment, encouraging their supporters to attend and show solidarity against my greed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and charged with animosity. Richard and Carol sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than attempting to argue an unwinnable case before a judge who clearly had little patience for family squabbles masquerading as legitimate legal disputes. Judge Margaret Chen called the proceedings to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of inheritance dispute imaginable. She'd reviewed the preliminary filings and was clearly unimpressed with the plaintiffs' arguments. "Mr. Henderson," she addressed Richard and Carol's attorney, "your clients are claiming that Thomas Whitmore lacked the mental capacity to make informed decisions about his estate. What specific evidence do you have to support this allegation?" Henderson fumbled through his notes, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore was elderly and isolated. He hadn't maintained regular contact with his family for many years, which suggests a deterioration in his judgment and social connections." Judge Chen's expression suggested she found this reasoning less than compelling. "Mr. Henderson, choosing not to maintain contact with family members is not evidence of mental incapacity. Many people make conscious decisions to limit their interactions with relatives for perfectly rational reasons. Do you have any medical evidence, testimony from healthcare providers, or documentation of cognitive decline?" "Well, no, Your Honor, but the circumstances of the will change are highly suspicious. Mr. Whitmore suddenly decided to leave his entire fortune to a niece he barely knew, while completely disinheriting his brother. This suggests he was being manipulated or coerced." Patricia rose to respond, her voice calm and professional. "Your Honor, if I may address the court's attention to Exhibit A, which is a letter written by Mr. Whitmore 6 months before his death, specifically explaining his reasons for choosing Miss Harper as his beneficiary. The letter demonstrates clear thinking, rational decision-making, and detailed knowledge of his family members, characters, and behaviors over many years." She handed copies of Uncle Tom's letter to the judge and to Henderson, who read it with growing dismay. The letter was devastating to their case, providing explicit reasoning that had nothing to do with manipulation and everything to do with Uncle Tom's careful observation of family dynamics over decades. Judge Chen read the letter thoroughly, occasionally glancing up at Richard and Carol with an expression that suggested she was forming her own opinions about their characters. When she finished, she set the document aside and addressed Henderson directly. "Mr. Henderson, this letter contradicts every aspect of your client's claims. Mr. Whitmore clearly states that he's making this decision based on years of observation and careful consideration. He specifically anticipates that his brother might challenge the will, and explains why such a challenge would be both predictable and unwarranted. How do you reconcile your claims of mental incapacity with this evidence?" Henderson had no answer. He shuffled through his papers desperately, looking for some argument that might salvage his case, but there was nothing to find. Uncle Tom had been too thorough in his preparations. Patricia then presented the Business Association video, medical records showing Uncle Tom's clean bill of mental health from his annual physical just 2 months before his death, and testimony from 3 of his longtime business associates who had worked with him regularly during his final year. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. Thomas Whitmore had been mentally sharp, legally competent, and fully justified in his decision to leave his estate to the niece who had impressed him with her character, rather than the brother who had treated him as an inconvenience. Judge Chen didn't even need to recess to make her decision. Mr. Henderson, your client's petition is not only without merit, it appears to be motivated by financial self-interest rather than legitimate concern for Mr. Whitmore's welfare or wishes. The estate will remain under Ms. Harper's control as specified in the will. Furthermore, I'm ordering your clients to pay all legal fees associated with this frivolous challenge. Richard's face turned red with rage as the judge's words sank in. Carol burst into tears, but they seemed more like tears of frustration than genuine grief. Their gamble had failed completely, and now they would be responsible for both their own legal costs and the substantial fees Patricia had accumulated preparing the defense. But the most satisfying moment came when Judge Chen addressed them directly. Mr. and Mrs. Harper, I want to be clear about something. This court has reviewed extensive evidence about your treatment of both your daughter and your brother-in-law over many years. The picture that emerges is not flattering. You appear to be people who view family relationships primarily as sources of financial support, and who become vindictive when that support is withdrawn or redirected. Mr. Whitmore's decision to bypass you in favor of Ms. Harper appears to have been not only legally sound, but morally justified. As we left the courthouse, Richard and Carol were surrounded by the same reporters who had eagerly covered their press conference the week before. But now the questions were hostile, focused on their failed lawsuit and the judge's scathing assessment of their motivations. The media narrative had shifted completely, and they found themselves defending their reputations rather than attacking mine. Outside the courthouse steps, Patricia turned to me with a satisfied smile. Well, that was about as decisive as these things get. The inheritance is yours, free and clear. Your parents have no further legal recourse, and they're now on the hook for substantial legal fees. But as I watched Richard and Carol navigate the hostile crowd of reporters, I realized this wasn't really about money or legal victories. It was about power, respect, and the fundamental question of who got to define my worth as a person. For 28 years, they had maintained control over my sense of self-value through a combination of emotional manipulation and financial dependency. Now that dynamic had been completely reversed. Uncle Tom's inheritance hadn't just made me wealthy. It had given me the resources to fight back against people who had spent decades trying to diminish me. The courthouse victory was satisfying, but it was also just the beginning. Richard and Carol had declared war on me the night they kicked me out of their house. Today, they learned what it felt like to lose that war decisively and publicly. But more importantly, I learned what it felt like to have the power to defend myself against people who had trained me to accept their mistreatment as normal. The scared, grateful daughter who had apologized for existing was gone. In her place stood someone who understood her own worth and had the resources to protect it. As Patricia and I walked toward our cars, she handed me a business card for a public relations firm. You might want to consider hiring them, she suggested. Your parents' media campaign damaged your reputation, even though we won in court. These people can help you rebuild your public image and tell your own story. I looked at the card, then at the reporters still harassing Richard and Carol on the courthouse steps. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I smiled, genuinely. Actually, I have a better idea. 6 months after the courthouse victory, I stood in the conference room of Whitmore Development Group's downtown Milwaukee headquarters, looking out at Lake Michigan while listening to my development team present plans for our latest acquisition. The transformation from homeless daughter to real estate mogul still felt surreal some days, but the numbers on the quarterly reports were undeniably real. Under my leadership, the company had expanded into 3 new markets and increased revenues by 38%. The better idea I'd mentioned to Patricia that day outside the courthouse had evolved into something more comprehensive than simple revenge. Instead of hiring a public relations firm to rehabilitate my image, I decided to let my actions speak for themselves. The story would tell itself through success, generosity, and strategic use of resources in ways that contrasted sharply with Richard and Carol's petty vindictiveness. My first major decision as owner of Whitmore Development had been to purchase a struggling strip mall on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. The property had been hemorrhaging money for years, with half the storefronts empty and the remaining tenants barely hanging on. Local investors had written it off as a lost cause, but I saw opportunity where others saw failure. The renovation took 4 months and cost nearly $2 million, but the results transformed not just the property but the entire neighborhood. Modern facades, updated infrastructure, competitive lease rates, and strategic tenant selection turned the forgotten shopping center into a thriving community hub. The project created 87 permanent jobs and generated significant tax revenue for the town. More importantly, it sent a clear message about my intentions and capabilities. While Richard and Carol had spent months telling anyone who would listen that I was an undeserving opportunist who had stolen money I didn't earn, I was investing that money in their community in ways that created tangible benefits for everyone. The psychological impact on my parents was exactly what I'd hoped for. Every time they drove past the renovated shopping center, every time they heard neighbors talking about the new jobs and businesses, every time the local newspaper ran another story about Whitmore Development's community investment, they were forced to confront the reality of what their daughter had accomplished. But the Cedar Falls project was just the beginning. Over the following months, I systematically acquired undervalued properties throughout Wisconsin, focusing on developments that would create jobs and revitalize struggling neighborhoods. Each success generated positive media coverage that further undermined the narrative Richard and Carol had tried to create about my character and motivations. The contrast became impossible to ignore. While they had spent years running a failing auto shop into the ground despite my financial support, I was building an empire that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in economic activity. While they had thrown me out of their house on my birthday, I was providing affordable housing for working families and supporting local businesses. The social dynamics in Cedar Falls shifted accordingly. People who had initially believed Richard and Carol's version of events began asking uncomfortable questions about their treatment of a daughter who was clearly capable of remarkable achievements. The sympathy that had initially flowed toward the boss parents gradually dried up as my successes accumulated and their bitterness became increasingly obvious. The breaking point came during Cedar Falls' annual Founders Day festival in September. I had donated $50,000 to upgrade the park facilities and sponsor free activities for families, continuing Uncle Tom's tradition of community support that Richard had always dismissed as showing off. The festival committee had asked me to speak at the opening ceremony, an invitation that generated considerable controversy among my parents, remaining supporters. I almost declined, knowing my presence would create drama and potentially spoil the celebration for everyone else. But Patricia convinced me that avoiding the event would be seen as weakness or shame, neither of which I felt about my accomplishments. The morning of the festival dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the outdoor celebration that drew families from throughout the region. I arrived early, before the crowds gathered, and walked through the park where I'd played as a child. The new playground equipment gleamed in the morning sun, and the renovated pavilion would provide shelter for concerts and community events for decades to come. As people began arriving for the festivities, I noticed the careful way they navigated around both me and my parents. Richard and Carol had set up near the auto shop's information booth, maintaining their territorial claim to the event they'd attended for 30 years. They watched me with undisguised hostility, but made no effort to approach or create a public scene. The opening ceremony began at noon, with Mayor Davidson introducing various sponsors and community leaders. When he called my name, the applause was genuine but uncertain, reflecting the complicated feelings many people had about the family drama that had played out so publicly. I kept my remarks brief and focused on Uncle Tom's legacy rather than my own achievements. Thomas Whitmore believed that success wasn't meaningful unless it lifted up the entire community. I told the crowd. He taught me that wealth is a tool for building something lasting, something that benefits everyone. This festival, this park, this town, represents the kind of investment he valued most. Investment in people and relationships that endure. The response was warmer than I'd expected. with many people approaching afterward to thank me for the donations and express support for my community development work. But the most significant moment came when Mrs. Patterson, my old high school math teacher, stopped by with her granddaughter. "I want you to know that I never believed what your parents were saying about you," she said quietly. "I watched you work at that auto shop for years, always helping, never complaining. Anyone with eyes could see who was supporting whom in that family." Her words carried weight because Mrs. Patterson was respected throughout Cedar Falls as someone who didn't engage in gossip or take sides in community disputes. If she was speaking publicly about the situation, it meant the tide of opinion had shifted decisively. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself relaxing and actually enjoying the festival for the first time since childhood. I played games with local kids, sampled food from the various booths, and had genuine conversations with people who were interested in my development projects rather than family gossip. The contrast with Richard and Carol's experience was stark. They spent the day at their booth, largely ignored by passers-by, who were more interested in the new businesses and improvements I'd funded than in supporting a failing auto shop run by people known for their bitterness and blame-shifting. Late in the afternoon, as the festival began winding down, Carol approached me for the first time since the courthouse confrontation. She looked older than her years, worn down by months of legal stress and social isolation. Her attempt at reconciliation was clumsy and transparently self-serving. "Natalie, I've been thinking that maybe we could work things out," she began, her voice carrying the forced warmth she used when she wanted something. "We're still family, after all. Maybe you could help us modernize the shop, bring it up to the standards you've set with your other projects." The audacity was breathtaking. After months of calling me a thief and a manipulator, after trying to steal my inheritance through fraudulent legal claims, after attempting to destroy my reputation throughout the community, she wanted to reconcile now that my success was undeniable and their isolation was complete. "I appreciate the offer," I said calmly, "but I'm not interested in working with people who view family relationships as business transactions. Uncle Tom taught me that real family supports each other unconditionally, not just when it's financially advantageous." Carol's mask slipped slightly, revealing the anger and frustration beneath her diplomatic attempt. "You can't stay angry forever, Natalie. We made mistakes, but we're still your parents. That has to count for something." "It does count for something," I agreed. "It counts as a lesson about what kind of person I don't want to be and what kind of relationships I don't want to accept. You taught me that blood doesn't guarantee love or loyalty or respect. Uncle Tom taught me that those things have to be earned and maintained through consistent actions over time." I could see Richard approaching from across the park, his face set in the hard lines that usually preceded one of his explosive outbursts. But before he could reach us, Jake Whitmore appeared at my elbow, having driven down from Milwaukee for the festival. "Natalie, are you ready to head back to the city?" he asked smoothly, offering me an exit from what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. "I promised to show you those development sites we discussed." As we walked away, I heard Richard's raised voice beginning what sounded like a familiar rant about ungrateful children and family betrayal. But his audience was limited to Carol and a few stragglers who were more interested in avoiding his anger than listening to his complaints. Driving back to Milwaukee that evening, Jake and I talked about Uncle Tom's vision for the company and the community impact we wanted to achieve. The conversation reminded me why I'd fallen in love with development work: the opportunity to create something lasting and meaningful, to solve problems through careful planning and strategic investment, to build communities rather than just accumulate wealth. "Dad would be proud of what you've accomplished," Jake said as we reached the city limits. "Not just the financial success, but the way you've handled the family drama with dignity." He always said that character shows most clearly when people are under pressure. The months that followed brought continued expansion for Whitmore Development and continued decline for Richard and Carol's situation. The auto shop finally closed in November, unable to compete with modern service centers and hurt by their reputation for poor customer relations. They sold the building at a significant loss and moved to a smaller house across town, their financial situation deteriorating as rapidly as their social standing. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy watching their downfall. They had made their choices based on their values and priorities, just as I had made mine. The consequences were simply the natural result of those decisions playing out over time. My own life, meanwhile, had expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined when I'd been sleeping on Zoe's fold-out couch just a year earlier. The company now employed over 200 people across 4 states. I'd been featured on the cover of Midwest Business Journal as one of the region's most promising young entrepreneurs. Development projects bearing the Whitmore name were transforming neighborhoods throughout the upper Midwest. More importantly, I'd built relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. My senior management team consisted of people who shared Uncle Tom's vision for ethical development practices. Jake and I had become genuinely close, united by our appreciation for the man who had seen potential in us that others had missed. Even my relationship with Zoe had deepened, strengthened by her unwavering support during my darkest period. The personal transformation was as significant as the professional success. The anxious, apologetic daughter who had spent years seeking approval from people who were determined not to give it had evolved into someone who understood her own worth independent of others' opinions. I no longer needed Richard and Carol's validation because I had built something meaningful that spoke for itself. 1 year after the courthouse victory, Patricia called with news that provided perfect closure to the entire ordeal. Richard and Carol had filed for bankruptcy, unable to meet the legal fee obligations from their failed lawsuit combined with their other debts. The irony was poetic. Their attempt to steal my inheritance had ultimately cost them what little financial security they'd had left. "They're asking if you'd be willing to negotiate a settlement on the legal fees," Patricia reported. "Their attorney suggests that family considerations might justify a reduced payment plan." I didn't need to think about my answer. "Tell them that family considerations are exactly why I won't negotiate. They made it clear that I'm not their family when they kicked me out on my birthday. They confirmed it when they tried to steal my inheritance. I see no reason to treat them better than they treated me." The bankruptcy proceeded without my intervention, and Richard and Carol faded from Cedar Falls society as quietly as they had once dominated it through their complaints and grievances. People stopped talking about the Harper family drama, moving on to fresher gossip and more current controversies. But I didn't forget the lessons their treatment had taught me. Every hiring decision, every partnership agreement, every personal relationship was evaluated through the lens of mutual respect and genuine reciprocity. I surrounded myself with people who valued what I brought to their lives, rather than those who saw me as a resource to be exploited. The company continued growing, and with it, my ability to make a positive impact on communities throughout the region. Each project honored Uncle Tom's memory, while building the legacy he had entrusted to my care. The scared, grateful daughter who had apologized for existing had become someone who commanded rooms, made decisions affecting hundreds of employees, and created opportunities that would benefit thousands of families. 2 years after my inheritance, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Patricia's office. The return address showed a nursing home in Florida, and the sender was someone named Margaret Harper, Richard's sister, who had moved away decades earlier and had no contact with the family. "Dear Natalie," the letter began, "I heard about your situation with Richard and Carol through mutual acquaintances, and I wanted you to know that their behavior doesn't surprise me. Richard has always been jealous of people who accomplish things he can't, and Carol has always enabled his worst impulses. Your Uncle Tom was right to see potential in you that they refused to recognize." Margaret went on to share stories about Richard's pattern of resentment and blame-shifting throughout their childhood, providing context that helped me understand that my experience wasn't unique or personal. Richard had always found reasons to resent successful people, always found ways to make their achievements about his own perceived failures. "What happened to you wasn't about your worth as a daughter or a person," Margaret concluded. "It was about their inability to accept that they had raised someone better than themselves. Tom understood that. I hope you do too." Reading Margaret's letter in the quiet of Uncle Tom's penthouse, now truly my home, I felt the last remnants of doubt and guilt finally dissolve. The family that had rejected me had revealed their true nature through their actions, just as I had revealed mine through my response to their rejection. I'd built an empire from their betrayal, created opportunities from their abandonment, transformed their attempt to diminish me into the foundation for achievements they could never have imagined. The daughter they'd discarded as worthless had become someone whose success would outlast anything they had ever accomplished. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the lake that Uncle Tom had loved, I realized that his greatest gift hadn't been the money or the business, or even the opportunity for revenge. His greatest gift had been the permission to stop apologizing for being exceptional, to stop shrinking myself to make others comfortable, to stop accepting less than I deserved because it was easier than fighting for more. The scared girl who had packed her belongings into cardboard boxes was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood that real family isn't about blood or obligation or shared history. Real family is about people who celebrate your successes rather than resent them, who support your dreams rather than diminish them, who value your presence in their lives rather than treat it as an inconvenience. Uncle Tom had given me more than an inheritance. He'd given me a blueprint for building the life I actually wanted, rather than the one other people expected me to accept. The empire I'd built wasn't just about real estate or financial success. It was about creating a world where worth was determined by actions rather than accidents of birth, where loyalty was earned rather than demanded, where love was demonstrated through respect rather than control. The woman I'd become would never again accept treatment that didn't match her value. The legacy I was building would ensure that Uncle Tom's vision of ethical success and community investment would continue long after I was gone. And the family I'd chosen, people like Jake and Zoe and Patricia and my management team, would always know they mattered not because they were obligated to matter, but because they'd proven they deserved to. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to become who you were always meant to be. Sometimes losing the family you thought you wanted makes room for the family you actually deserve. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming so successful that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. Richard and Carol had wanted me to disappear so they could continue their comfortable dysfunction without the inconvenience of a daughter who reminded them of their failures. Instead, I'd become impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that the child they'd discarded had been the most valuable thing they'd ever possessed. The empire I'd built from their betrayal would stand long after their bitterness was forgotten, a testament to the power of choosing yourself when the people who should have chosen you decide you're not worth the effort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.